Hello, everyone. Lovely to have you join me here this evening. I'm Sarah Wilson, and I am an author, a former journalist, and an activist. And most recently, I've written the book, This One Wild and Precious Life, that came out just a couple of weeks ago and is in Dymocks bookstores around the country. So I'm sure some of you have read the book. You may be here because you've read the book but never heard of me. You're now putting a face to that. So this evening, I thought that we might have a bit of a casual chat. I've put on a blazer over the top of my Pilates gear, so I'm trying to look presentable for you all, but we'll keep it reasonably casual. Mostly I'd love to hear your questions, and I know that you can start asking the questions whenever you like and they get moderated, and at the end I'll allow plenty of time for your questions, because that's the way that I learn, and I write books predominantly to learn myself. So I thought I'd start off by actually talking about why I wrote this book. And for those of you who've not seen it yet, this is it here. It's got sparkles on the cover. I wrote the book because my previous book, First We Make the Beast Beautiful, which is a book about my own internal, battle or journey with anxiety. And my aim was to reframe anxiety beyond the medical model and through a philosophical and spiritual lens. And that journey, of course, went inwards. Now, over the last couple of years, I was observing as I was on tour, and I travelled around the world with just a 15-kilo backpack on my back, to sort of, promote the book, but also just to ask more questions that came off the back of First We Make the Beast Beautiful. And I was observing when I was speaking on various TV shows and in various conferences and so on, that there was a real need to address, I suppose, an external anxiety. I felt that the itch, the disconnect, the sense that we were missing something, which I think is at the core of anxiety, was occurring at a global and collective level. And many of you may have heard of this idea of the monk who goes up into a cave and meditates for years and years on end, and eventually he realizes, what's the point of this if I don't share this with humanity? And so his big trip or his big journey is to come back down the mountain into the village and share his knowledge. Not that I'm a monk, I don't profess to have that kind of wisdom, but I definitely felt that the journey needed to be going outwards. So the other thing I observed, I've been an activist in the climate area for a very long time, most of my life, even during my time as the editor of Cosmo and working in mainstream media, the host of MasterChef and so on. I was very active in this area, and I was observing that the climate debate was just not getting anywhere. People weren't mobilising. And I compared it with what was happening in World War II. And the comparison is often made, and I make the comparison at a number of junctures in my book, that during World War II, America, for instance, on the other side of the world from where the war was actually happening, mobilised from a consumer economy to a wartime economy in 3 weeks. You also hear sort of studies that show that during the London Blitz, Brits were actually the happiest they've ever been. They were completely on board and mobilised, and in fact, anxiety and suicide levels dropped to almost zero during that time. Such was the state of collective kind of action that was going on at the time. So I was asking, why the hell isn't it happening around the climate debate? And I guess the predominant thing that I identified is that when you're talking about a war, there's an identifiable enemy. And what was happening originally with the climate debate, but then it expanded to COVID, and then, of course, we had the bushfires, and then we had the Black Lives Matters protests. And the difference is that with a war, there's an identifiable enemy. What we were confronting today was the fact that we are, in fact, both the victim and also the perpetrator. And that causes an incredible sense of dread, guilt, overwhelm. I described it as an itch. So I set out to kind of find a path through this sensation and hopefully towards more engagement, more connection, and hopefully a way to save this one wild and precious life. Now, having put on this blazer and clearly impressed you with my professionalism, I'm now going to have to take it off because it's stinking hot here in Sydney tonight. It's actually like a summer's evening. All right, so that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to address that itch that I was feeling was happening at the collective level. I didn't feel we were talking about it, and I felt that we were talking about it in a way that was very disconnected, and I also think that it was making us feel very lonely, and that was in itself adding to the overwhelm and the anxiety. So I might talk to you a bit about how I wrote the book and how I write all my books, actually. I don't set out with this kind of polemic in mind, this idea that, you know, the arc's going to go like this and we're going to go on a hero's journey and this is where I'm going to end up. I actually set out in a sort of a meta way in real time and to go and investigate something that I feel has been largely unaddressed, and that readers in my social media community are asking about, you know. So thank you for addressing it. Thank you, Hayley. Thank you for saying that. So I set off literally not knowing where I'm going to end up, and I go through the proverbial ringer, trying to navigate various things. So I set off, and for 3 years, I travelled around the world with one backpack. I reduced all of my life belongings from 2 suitcases about 10 years ago down to 1 suitcase and eventually down to a carry-on bag. And I followed in the footsteps of philosophers, thinkers, spiritualists around the world and investigated their thinking around these universal themes, and some patterns started to occur. And along the way, I realised that hiking was one of the techniques that was not only going to provide a salve, but it was also going to be the way that I could tell this story. Because let's face it, for anyone who started reading the book, there's some pretty heavy stuff going on in this book, you know, and it got heavy for me. And I navigated it by hiking, but I also felt that I could make it less heavy and sexier by providing these wonderful hikes. So, for instance, I pull apart the neoliberal system, and in one very long chapter, and I tell the story while hiking in the footsteps of Heidi, who is a childhood character. I don't know if any of you have read the book Heidi by Joanna Spruit. It was written in the late 1800s when industrialisation was really making much of Europe sick. And there was a lot of discourse against capitalism. And people were very much questioning it. And so this fictional story, which later became a movie with Disney, I think it was, starring Shirley Temple, sees this little girl getting sick from industrialisation and moved out to the Swiss Alps to be with her grumpy grandfather and goats and frolicking and hiking in the mountains. So I went off to this area that's literally called Heididorf, where there are no cars allowed, it's horse and cart, and went and followed in the footsteps with my friend who happens to be able to yodel. Now, it turns out that in exactly the same area, Friedrich Nietzsche was writing Thus Spoke, and I've got the book here actually, Zarathustra. I don't know if any of you have read that book, but he was writing that book there, and it also was a critique of industrialisation and capitalism. So I was sort of investigating both of these themes and then parlaying it into where we are today and why it's making us so disconnected from this one wild and precious life. So I did that while hiking to make it sexier. So I went off on this big trek, and I do about 15 hikes in the book, and I explore a bunch of ideas. And one of the first things I had to do was actually address the way we were discussing it, sort of, I guess, around in the media, in politics and so on. Identified a few things. Loneliness was something that a lot of people like to say is what's going on. We hear a lot about a loneliness epidemic, and in the UK there's a minister for loneliness. And obviously once COVID hit, loneliness certainly became a real issue in our culture. But I felt that there was a missing piece here. It's not that we're feeling less social connections. We've got more social connections than ever before. What we're actually missing is meaningful connection with others, but also meaningful connection with ourselves and with life. And so there's a phrase that actually came about with the ancient Greeks. It was picked up again by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and then again in the 1950s, and it's surfaced once again. And the term is moral loneliness, or acedia. acedia being a Greek word. And it's this kind of listless slothfulness, which is a really hard thing to say when you've got a lisp like I do. And it refers to this real disconnect from our values matrix. And I feel that that's got a lot to do with where we are today. I also look at technology and some of the ideas there. I argue that technology is merely an enabler. And a lot of the things that we blame technology for are things that actually we've enabled in ourselves, and then technology makes it that much easier. I argue quite brutally that it's enabled us to be small humans, small versions of ourselves. It's allowed us to cocoon ourselves. So most of the technology developments over the last 20 years haven't been about necessarily improving the world. They've been predominantly about protecting us from discomfort, from inconveniences, from having to delay gratification, from having to wait for anything. And so that's actually left us very, very unresilient, and it's left us quite ascetic and slothful and small and not particularly courageous and brave, and which are all qualities I feel we need in 2020 and beyond. I also, as I mentioned before, talk about capitalism and pull that apart, and as well as some of the climate science that we are disagreeing on or confused about. So I sort of got through all those fairly dry bits. I had a bit of fun with it, pulling apart the theories while hiking in different parts of the world, meeting all kinds of different people, poets and so on. But then I hit an absolute dead end. And it happened a couple of times, but it really came to a head during the bushfires in January here in Australia. And I was looking around and I was like, we're not going to mobilise. We're not going to mobilise in time. We are also overwhelmed. My neighbours have given up on recycling. Everyone's walking around with takeaway coffee cups. What is going on? And I hit a real slump, and I really didn't think I could get this book done. And it was due a month later. And of course, the bushfires happened. I delayed the book. COVID happened. It had to be delayed again. And as a friend said, could you just please get this to the printers, because Martians will land or something if you don't actually get this book to the printers. It seemed like the longer I delayed it, there was more disasters were happening, or hyper objects as they're now called, and black swans. So I hit this dead end, which I'm sure many of you who are watching this probably know what I mean. There's a sense, and particularly I imagine those of you who are living in Victoria, there's this sense that, gosh, when is this going to end? And are we going to lift ourselves? Are we going to return? There was this sense of homesickness, a need to return to what we're really meant to be about. It felt like we were a long way from home, and I felt a long way from home. And a couple of things happened. My meditation teacher said to me, Sarah, you do all of this stuff. You live minimally. You are an activist because you love it. You've got to show us the joy. You've got to show us that it's a more charming option than the alternative. And that really started to lift me a bit. And he was right. I love living the way I do. I live in a very minimal way. I have lived in this apartment that I rent in Bondi for 2.5 years, but before that, 8 years I spent on the road. I had no possessions. I still don't own a car. I ride a single speed bike. Very, very, very minimal with the way I live. I eat people's food scraps. That's kind of become a bit of a story now, folklore, but it's indeed true. And he said, you do it because you find joy in it. So I needed to find a through line that brought joy to readers. I also had a situation where I was dating a guy, and he was fairly bodacious, and he invited me over for dinner one night. And he said, look, can I read to you? I was quite upset. I was in this kind of quandary, this funk with where I was going with the book. And he said, why don't I read to you? So he told me to come and go and choose a book from his bookshelf. The one that I chose had a fabric cover with embossed lettering and the mothbally smell of things old and treasured. It was called A Strange Language, a collection of Vedic poems and musings written in the 1930s by Pundit Acharya. I'm probably saying that really, really badly. Apologies. The artist dude, this guy that I was dating was an artist. The artist dude opened it randomly and read from a passage about how lost humans have become in their fleeing from nature. Come hold my hand. and we shall run away from the intelligence of man. His intellect is a petrified lie. We shall go back to life. Come, hold my hand. We shall go back to life. I asked him to stop. Bingo. What if this could be our path to reconnection? To drop the rational, head-orientated right versus wrong dialogue that blocks our feelings and our souls, and to simply go back to life, as in go straight back to it, go back to nature, go back to our nature, and to do it together. We can hold hands. The ideas sang. In an instant, I became unstuck and knew that this was my way forward. So the next day I did what I normally do, and I went hiking. And I thought I might read you a little bit of the hike out. And yeah, the timing and placement of things. It happened quite a lot in the writing of this book, and it's an idea that I do actually explore about the idea of releasing your grip on life. And there's a particularly good anecdote, which I won't ruin by telling you here, involving Maria Shriver. It is completely bizarre. It blew my mind at the time, but I won't tell you it here. You have to read the book. So the following day I got up early, stuffed a train pass down my bra, tied on my hiking shoes, and did what I always do when a breakthrough idea needs to germinate fully: walk. I boarded a dawn train to Australia's oldest national park, an hour south of Sydney. When I arrived, I started hike jogging along the Ulula track, an 11-kilometre single track from Heathcote Station to Waterfall. I know to do this when fretful overwhelm grinds me to a halt, to stop, hightail it into nature and just move. The trail wound up and down gullies and through deep prehistoric undergrowth. It passed a series of pools and rocky flats. I didn't stop to swim. I had a surfeit of adrenaline that I had to pump out of my being. The whip birds were at it, the warm morning exciting them into a chatty crescendo. I ground up and over rocks through creek beds, and slowly my clanging thoughts began to order themselves, just as a flock of birds formed an orderly V shape and darted off, moving in a seamless cohesion with no designated leader. I remember reading that naturalists early last century struggled to define this awesome organising force that took a flock to where it needed to be. I thought about it now as I started to find my flow on the trail. In the absence of a scientific explanation, they called the phenomenon group soul. And I should say also that in 2013, scientists came up with the term murmuration to describe this behaviour in starlings specifically. And it uses principles of physics to map the patterns that these birds kind of do. But nobody's actually been able to find out how it actually happens without a leader making the first move. In the absence of a scientific explanation, they called the phenomenon group soul. Group soul. Goodness, what a marvellous term for something so indescribable, yet so known and intuitively true. And it hit me, just as the Vedic poem had the night before. We go back to life by unifying with group soul. So I go on and on. I go on this walk. It does great things. Back at the station, as I waited for the train to the city, I jotted down my thoughts on a scrap of paper. I'd also put down my bra with a pencil. It sounds like I wear a very large bra, but it's amazing what you can actually fit in there. And I like to run, hike, walk, or run hike, as I like to call it, but nothing to carry. So I'll often keep a bottle of water in an old jar or something at the start of a walk and drink it, and then I come back and I fill it up at somebody's tap when I get back to the train station. So I jotted down my thoughts on a scrap of paper. I'd also put down my bra. We go back to life, I wrote. We go back to nature, and the how is taken care of. Then it becomes fun. I got home and started rewriting the whole manuscript through this simple, fired up and hopeful lens. So that was just one of the shorter hikes. I obviously also paraphrased it, but it's how I actually nut out some of the complex ideas and some of the trauma and the anxiety and the overwhelm that I felt partway through the book, I actually explain in quite a lot of detail about why hiking walks. And in Japan, where I also go, I go to Japan to find this particular monk, this Shinto monk, in the middle of this mountain range south of Kyoto, and it was quite hard to get to. And I hiked for 4 days to go and meet this guy, and I got there and I said to him, look, I've come because all these people around the world have told me that you're the world expert on what's called forest bathing. And forest bathing, by the way, it's in Japan and South Korea, it's part of the health policy of these nations. And so health insurance covers it off. Children that are having a really hard time with or learning difficulties or bullies are sent off to forests just to actually be present, to hike in nature. And so there's about 40,000 plus studies that have been done to show why hiking in nature can have this incredible effect on a bunch of health indicators, both mental and physical. And one of the ones that I really like, which I think pertains very much to where we're at the moment, is the fact that hiking or walking in nature goes at the same pace as discerning thought. And the rationale behind that is that we emerged as upright humans on 2 legs instead of crawling around on all 4s. And at that time, a lot of our brain functioning that defines us as humans, so discerning thought, an ability to do reflective thinking, evolved at the same time in the same part of the brain. And so, yes, Kirsty said, go to nature for inspiration. Well, some of these studies explain why that works. We know it to be true because we've grown up with it. We've experienced it, but science is now able to explain it in a range of different ways. And so we emerged as upright humans. At the same time, we emerge as humans able to do discerning thought. So when we walk, it's at the same pace and it enables discerning thought. And there is so much about the problems of the world today that stem from the fact that we can't get clear thinking. Fake news, truth decay, the attention economy, the incredible distraction, the toggling. It's very much about not having the space and the ability to think with discernment. So that's one that I really like. Fractals as well is an interesting area of all of this. So our eyes, our retinas work to these patterns that occur all throughout nature called fractals. And so we see these fractals in things like tidal pools and the patterns of fronds in ferns and things like that, and petals and all kinds of things, clouds and rainbows. And so when we're in nature and we see this fractal patterning, there's this attunement, which I think is a beautiful word as well. Now, there's far more studies to do with hormonal interruptions, you know, the way that positive and negative ions work. You can go and do a bit of the research in the links that I provide on my website that correspond to the book, if you like. But the point is that walking in forests, walking in nature has this incredible effect on us. So that's essentially why I hiked, and then I do include a chapter that explains that. So after establishing where we've gone wrong in life, I feel that, you know, there's this acedia, there's this moral disconnection from what matters. I then set out to try to find a way to reconnect to our values. And there's a number of practices that I describe. So I go to Greece and I talk to Greeks about this idea of philotimos, which is the love of honor or giving to strangers. And that had a phenomenal effect on me. And I go through quite a traumatic experience there and get held by the Greeks, by Greek strangers. And I share a fair bit about my love of Zorba the Greek and a bunch of other sort of Greek folklores as I hike in Crete. I talk about soul nerding. It's a term. There's ways of connecting spiritually and with meaning, and we can do it through religion or contemporary spirituality that we've adopted from the East, or we can soul nerd. And soul nerd is the practice of ensconcing ourselves in literature and art and classical music and biology and philosophy for the express purpose of having a deeper understanding of our souls. Now, that can happen at a very literal level, but even the practice of discerning reading, deep reading, where we've got to concentrate and we've got to apply ourselves to even the spaces between the words, particularly with poetry. And I was never into this. I didn't grow up with it. I'm a Philistine, really, I am. And I didn't read literature. It was just, I didn't go to a school that did that. It was mostly about just keeping us in school on our study. So this is stuff that I had to kind of learn later in life. And I taught myself art. I taught myself an appreciation of this stuff in the writing of this book, and also First We Make the Beast Beautiful. And then I go into the science as to why this works and why it can reconnect us with what matters once again. So I choose some fun practices that are a fair bit about returning to practices that we've known throughout history to work. There's a legacy in human nature of knowing that this kind of stuff works. Another one that I really liked, and I think I included in the Philotimos chapter, the Greek kindness chapter, is the Persian. In Persia, they have this way of saying "How are you?" So we say "How are you?" in our culture, and people generally say, "Oh, I'm okay, thanks," and move on. Or generally, "Busy, I'm busy." That's the default answer these days, and not a lot of care is put into the asking of the question, or even the giving of the answer, or even listening to the answer. And in Persia, they have this beautiful way of asking, "How are you?" It translates to, "How is your heart in this breath?" And even in the asking of the question, you're present. How is your heart in this breath? It takes us right into the moment. And of course, you're forced to answer in a meaningful way. And it just opens up dialogue quite beautifully. So I've been using that phrase in emails and when I ring some of my friends from the other side of the world on WhatsApp and so on. I then move into the second half of the book, the final section of the book. And I talk about how once we've got connected and we realise the importance of this, what are we going to do with it? And so I actually say we've got to get wild. We've got to get activated. And that's where I actually set up, I suppose, something of a polemic for people, almost more like a crash course in how to get very heartfelt engaged with life and changing the world. That section of the book's called "And Now We Change the World." And I look at the practices that actually do work. And one thing that, you go on a book tour and you start to get feedback and you start to hear what resonates with people, which is really, really wonderful. And one of the little snippets from the book that really resonates is this idea that 3.5% is this figure, this magical figure. So there's a woman called Elaine Chatsworth, I think her name was, and she studied every peaceful protest demanding change from 1900 to 2014. And what she found is that every single protest that managed to garner 3.5% of any given population succeeded, in that it actually was able to get the change that it was asking for. So you only need 3.5% of the population and you are guaranteed a result. And I find that very activating because 3.5% is not a great deal of people. And we saw this in the September 20 protests or rallies, the schools for climate change that happened around the world. And we didn't get too far off that 3.5% figure, but I very much felt that if we had got to 3.5%, something radical could have shifted in the world. And I think it did make a big difference. I think it really did put the climate on the agenda for a lot of people, and it also highlighted how important it is to young people and what we owe to young people. Anyway, what happens when you get 3.5%, of course, is that you see that care begets care and it grows exponentially. And so I have a whole heap of sort of information to that effect to show that humans are capable of extraordinary stuff. I close out the book with a very, very personal anecdote, and it leads me to the penultimate chapter that's about becoming an adult and actually growing up. And that's what I think we are missing. I feel that we're a society that is stuck in an adolescent mode where we are blaming outwards and we're waiting for someone to come and save us, somebody to come and sort our shit out for us. And I feel that we are very close to this stage of realising we're going to have to do it ourselves. We are going to have to get courageous and do what is required. And that interspersed with my ideas around getting wild, getting somewhat deviant and defiant. These ideas that we find very frightening, but I find once you embrace them and understand what's really behind it, it makes a hell of a lot of sense. So I arrive at what I feel is a radical notion of hope. And my idea is that to get hopeful, we need to learn to reconnect with and love this one wild and precious life, because when we love something so hard, we will save it. We know those stories of those mothers who are 50 kilos and can lift a car off their toddler when it's rolled backwards onto their child. Humans are capable of extraordinary stuff. I use the example of World War II and the mobilisation that happened. And there's just one other analogy. I use quite a few metaphors throughout the book, but this one I think is really important. Sports metaphors often work the best, particularly with blokes, and this is my favourite. Dad loved it when I shared it over a Sunday dinner, and I know he shares it among his friends and brothers. It's a bit like in the final minutes of a football grand final and the losing side is down 3 points. And by the way, this metaphor is not too far-fetched either. The doomsday clock, developed by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947, ticked over to 100 seconds to midnight in early 2020. Some of you might have seen that in the news. The stands are starting to clear out. It's looking hopeless for the losing side, but suddenly something shifts in the group soul of this about-to-lose team. The standard tactics are tossed aside and the humans go into what I call kamikaze mode. They throw everything at the situation. The crowd stops. What's going on? They can't believe what they're seeing. They go wild. The whole scene is wild. We're down to the final 5 seconds, and seemingly out of nowhere and as if by magic, the losing team do everything they can and plant the try or kick the goal. The siren sounds. Hope has favoured the wild. This kind of sporting miracle happens more often than it logically should, and it's these games that go down in history. So that is kind of where I arrive. I believe that we can save this one wild and precious life, but we are going to have to throw everything at it, and I think that humans are capable of it, and I think that we will simultaneously rise to the best version of ourselves in the process. So I don't think I've given away the best bits of the book, and I don't know how many of you listening have in fact read it. You might have some questions. I think we'll throw to questions now. We've got about, let me see, 12 minutes for questions. So I think they're going to roll through shortly. And just while I'm waiting, if you could recommend one hike anywhere in the world, which would it be and why? Thanks, Hayley. Look, I would say I've never done, look, you know what my answer to that is? It's not going to be very satisfying for you. My favourite hike is my next hike. Basically, I've never done a hike in my life that I haven't come back from and gone, that was awesome. I've never regretted a hike. In the book, I suppose one of my favourite hikes was the one I did in Japan. There was another one I did in Sierra Nevada, which was, I was hiking in the snow and I heard avalanches in the middle of the night and I had a bear canister because there's bears in this area, and that was pretty epic. It was a really awesome trip and I had a lot of stuff going on and a lot of stuff to sort out, and I had all kinds of adventures. I think some of the best hikes are here in Australia. The Larapinta Trail, if you're wanting to have a bit of an introduction, there's a way of doing it. There's about 3 different ways that you can do the Larapinta. It heads out west across the McDonald Ranges from Alice Springs. If you want a desert hike, that classic kind of desert hike, you can do it on your own. Very, very tricky because you've got to do food drops and water drops, or you can do it as a sort of a kind of glamping experience. If you want to really treat yourself. Cradle Mountain Hike in Tasmania is a really, really good one as well. I'll see if there's another question that comes through. We see Sharon. Sharon Villaverde? What was the motivation for writing this book? As your dad says, it's a book about everything. Why would you take this on? Well, it's exactly what my father asked. He actually, yes, in the WhatsApp group, and you've obviously read part of the book, he referred to it as Sarah's book of everything. Why would I take it on? Well, it does cover off so much, and it was the biggest project I've ever worked on. It did take a solid 3 years to write. Why did I do it? Well, I kind of got started and I just had to keep walking my way through to the end of the journey, to be honest. I'm very determined. It's no big secret I have bipolar, and one of the gifts that it offers for someone, as well as some of the hardships, is that it means that you don't give up very easily, and you will keep going and going and going until you get the answer, the satisfying and hopefully beautiful answer that you were looking for. So the thing is, everything got us into this mess, and it's going to take everything to get out of it. And to write a book that I really wanted to put my name to, and that I sacrificed a lot to produce, and will continue to sacrifice to keep the message going for many years to come, I hope. I really did have to go and look at everything that contributed to this, and not all the facts and figures and data and rights and wrongs and political ideas, because that was getting us nowhere. And Sharon, you probably remember in the book, I give up on that idea. This whole didactic right versus wrong sort of approach was polarizing things way too far. And so I quote that Rumi poem, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And I felt that to be able to meet in that field, I needed to cover off all the factors so that we could actually arrive there compassionately and with understanding. I needed to understand it to be able to convincingly have a conclusion that I felt provided hope. I didn't believe that we had hope until I wrote this book. I had to go on this journey and live out the considerations and reconnect myself with the magic of human nature again, to believe that there is hope. And I'm extremely hopeful now. And as a result, my life has become richer and more important to me than ever before, if that makes sense. And that's the other upside of going on this journey, I feel. Anna Rose, hello. Anna, I met in the climate movement a couple of years ago and was with me on this journey. She does incredible work. Which unusual people, leaders, organisations have approached you since the book has come out, wanting to exercise greater leadership on climate change? Good question. So I've had, well, ironically, I give most of my money to charity, and so I get approached by insurance agencies and banks very often to come and talk about how to have a life of meaning without money. There's irony in that. I have been approached most recently, however, by one of, if not the biggest insurance companies in the world, who are making a very concerted shift towards more sustainable solutions, to work with them on a potential project, which is really interesting. The world is shifting, and that may not happen. In fact, it probably won't happen, and Anna Rose will know this from her work in the area. She's probably more knowledgeable in this than I am. It probably won't happen at the political level. It's going to happen at a grassroots level, and I think it'll happen with industry, because sustainable options make more sense financially now. This is a dialogue that we don't tend to have. So definitely that. I am getting businesses wanting to talk about more sustainable ways of going about things, and I'm getting people wanting to have dialogue about becoming more resilient to uncertainty, and to discussing these big issues in a different context. There's a real hunger for this kind of a discussion, and ultimately the conversation is what matters. We feel so alone, and when we operate as a globe of isolates, as this wonderful American Catholic nun called it. She said, we're a globe of isolates hanging out in the jacuzzi. And she's like, we've got to get out of that jacuzzi. We've got to get activated. So Sister Joan's awesome. But when we're operating this isolated way, that's when things like the QAnon stuff and the conspiracy theories take off, and this horrible loneliness seeps in. And, you know, I think this more connected way of going about things actually addresses all the things, everything that got us here in the first place. Let me see. Anthony Gracia. You'll have to excuse my eyesight, especially at this time of night in the dark. Question. There is a current view around that the silver lining of the COVID pandemic could be to utilise this situation as a global reset, i.e. social change, etc. Do you believe that society will simply revert to the old normal, or will we have, I think the question's run out, but I can guess what you're asking, or will we have to create a new kind of normal? I believe that COVID certainly has provided us with an opportunity to start with a fresh way of thinking. Now, Naomi Klein says it really well. She refers, actually, no, she didn't say it. She actually quoted Milton Friedman, who said that a disaster or a pandemic, a crisis, actually can lead us to change our thinking, and it can actually change the world, but it will depend on the ideas that are lying around at the time. So we've had a pause, I think, placed on our life, and I feel that COVID's been the big revealer. It has exposed a whole range of redundancies. It's made us pause. It's made us look at what is kind of underneath the blanket that's been put over the top of everything, and we can see it all very clearly. Now, I agree, we might go back to the old normal, and or we could actually start to listen and spend time for developing ideas, so that when we do emerge again, the ideas that are lying around are fruitful ideas. So this time, and I hate to say this, living in Bondi, where I have relative freedom compared with anyone in Melbourne in particular at the moment, we can use this time to start to think about these things, to have the conversation, so that the ideas that are lying around are sophisticated, they're adult, they're courageous, they're wild, they're progressive, they're hopeful, and they're entirely reverential of this life, this one wild and precious life. And I think some of those conversations have got to involve young people, and we should really be talking to young people for a whole range of reasons, because they are the most affected by the COVID pause, reset, whatever you want to call it. So I think the most important thing we can do to have the greatest chance that we can move on from what's happening at the moment is start to discuss these ideas now, and to start to agitate and to write to our local MPs and to get involved in this gas debate that's happening at the moment, and you know, get educated so that we can start to see change, because change begets change, education begets education. That 3.5% of engagement can become something really quite beautiful. Now, I don't know if we've got probably time for one more question. Rachel May, could you talk a little more to the spaces between the words when you read poems, and what this experience is for you? As a newly practicing soul nerd, I am struggling to understand this concept. Yeah, it's one that you've almost got to feel into, Rachel. So poetry isn't like prose. Prose kind of gallops us along, you know, through a storyline. What poetry does is it deposits ideas that are more representations, and it's the space around it. It won't be the literal meaning that takes us to a different space. Regular prose will describe the author's thoughts on something, and we can follow it, and it makes sense and it resonates. However, poetry deposits impressions, and what I mean by the pause or the space between the words, it's almost what's not said. It's the magic of what can happen in our imaginations when just a few simple words are placed there. It doesn't need to be explained. There's this group soul experience where you can read out a beautiful poem and it doesn't have to be explained. Not all the words are there that provide the explanation, but we all go to a very similar emotional openness. And it's the reflecting on that magic, the fact that a poet has been able to take us somewhere in so few words and to such a common human experience that goes beyond language. Being able to reflect on that is the magical bit. It's that pause. It's where you close your eyes and allow the impression, not the words, but the impression to sink in. Now, I've got the last question screen coming up. So, Hayley, you're the lucky one. Hayley King, thank you very much for your last question. What's the best tip you'd give to someone who's literally just starting their hiking journey? Okay, well, put one foot in front of the other. I would say get some apps where you can go and get some inspiration. So if you're in New South Wales, Wild Walks is great. All Trails is a fantastic one. We Are Explorers have some great hikes on there that can actually set you up and turn it into a sort of lifestyle adventure. I, as of next week, will also have all the hikes from my book on a website called Sarah Wilson Hikes. So you can go and have a look at that and maybe favourite or flag it in anticipation of the hikes coming up. And just do some research around that. Also, the New South Wales National Parks, all the various national park sites also have some great hikes on there. I really like doing a train stop to train stop hike. There's this sense of adventure. If it's under 3 hours, you probably only need you don't need a lot of water. 1.5 litres would be heaps. I tend to drink lots of water before I go. I've got to be very responsible with my information here. If you're just starting out, take plenty of water. I wouldn't worry too much about your gear. Just wear running shoes. Do a not so difficult hike. Take a friend, because I know that people do get scared hiking on their own. Generally, hiking sites will say a walk might be 3 hours or something. You'll probably need 3 hours, but as you get better at it, somebody said join a bushwalking club. There's heaps of those. Or just look up in your local area. Go to Facebook, they'll have some groups. So that's a really wonderful way of doing it. It doesn't suit me because I am a bit of an introvert and I just love hiking on my own. But yeah, my thing is just don't even worry about it. You won't have a bad hike. You just start. I like doing a loop track because it forces me to do the whole thing and there's this sense of completion. But if you're starting out, you might want to do one where you only have to walk an hour in and our back, you're not going to land in too much trouble. So yeah, and if you go to sarahwilson.com, you'll see that I've got quite a few hikes on there. You can also go through my Instagram. There's a hashtag Sarah Wilson Hikes, and I geotag where I go hiking with the name of the hike, and so you can go and Google that. Just start, do a 2 hour hike, then increase it to a 3 hour, and so on. So I think that's all we've got time for. I will just say thank you so much to Dymocks for being just a really wonderful supporter of this book. It's a challenging book. It's a book that I know that many of the Dymocks staff have been supportive of, and I really applaud you because it's a tricky book. It is a really tricky book, and I make no apologies for it. I put sparkles on the cover and I've put lots of fun hikes throughout it, and I do promise you that I do bring the joy that I have found. I really do try to show that it's a more joyful way of living, and hopefully it comes to you as an invite. I never try to have didactic books that tell you must do this. I mean, I Quit Sugar, I gave it a go. I've got some information that might help you. You might want to try it too. First We Make the Beast Beautiful was an invitation to see things a little differently. It's a conversation. And this one too. It really is a conversation. It's really an invite to see if you can explore the aspects of your own being, the aspects that matter to you, and to see whether you can reconnect it with it. And join me in saving, hopefully, this one wild and precious life we've been granted. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Sue, and all the team at Dymocks. I've really enjoyed this evening, and I'll see you on tour in the new year, 2021, around Australia to continue this conversation further. All right. Good night, everyone.